guys. Welcome to another episode of Evolve. I am your host, Monette Brann-Natta, and I'm so happy to have you joining me today to share some energy. I want to talk today about living your life in full. And my guest today has lived her life in full, and I think has a few things to teach us. But before I introduce you to Sally, I want to tell you how I got to know Sally. I grew up in a town that was predominantly Caucasian, and if you've been listening for a while and you know me, I'm sure you can imagine that I may have been a peculiar sight in that environment. When my friends' parents didn't know what to make of me or outright instructed their children to cease having a relationship with me because it hurt their business simply because of my color, my guest today took a decidedly different stance. She not only welcomed me into her home and life, but she gave me the opportunity of employment at her place of business. She could have stopped there, but Sally is not one to do things halfway. She instead spent time with me and mentored me, explaining the way the world could be for me, no matter my gender or race. Maya Angelou often talked about a watershed moment in her life when a woman, a teacher in her town, took time to mentor her. She would have her over for tea and lemon cookies, and they would while away the afternoon in conversation. Well, for Sally and I, it was bagels and lox. Sally has always had good taste. She planted seeds in my soul that have manifested into beautiful fruit, all because she didn't subscribe to the atmosphere that I was born into. She shifted my paradigm by simply refusing to accept societal norms, and she shifted her paradigm by simply refusing to accept the societal norms that she was born into. She was and is a maverick. You create the life you want, Monette, and you can have whatever you are willing to work for, period. You see, Sally came of age in a cultural revolution with words swirling in the lexicon about peace, love, and free love, and no war. Sally incarnated into a life that was honestly built to accommodate a woman that looked like her, that being a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, gorgeous Southern woman of a debutante ilk. But she chose to break free of those confines at every step in her life. From the wisdom of her mother's bosom, she took in strength and exhaled the toxicity of her time, a toxicity of oppression that limited a woman's role to the restricted ambitions of the men that surrounded them. The way she looked was Sally's cross to bear. We all have a cross to bear. In spite of this, she figured out new ways to maneuver in a world that hadn't caught up to her progressive stance. Sally is a genius. I don't mean that in a figurative sense, folks. I mean that Sally is an actual tested genius. She's a gifted musician and a businesswoman who has utilized her quick wit to be at the apex of technology and finance as a woman in the 70s and 80s when that simply was not done. With her child strapped to her chest, from the boardroom to the laundry room, Sally has been ahead of her time. From donning orange vests to help women through the picket lines of protesters at women's clinics to a stint in the 90s where she worked with the CIA and Homeland Security, her life truly reads like a novel. But today she's here to enlighten us about a couple of chapters. Sally has taught me that you dive into life and you figure out how to do it as you go. You do not say no when an opportunity presents itself. I am confident that before the show is over, Sally will have taught you something invaluable too. I'm so grateful to have you here today, Sally.
Oh, good afternoon, Monette. How are you?
I am feeling fine, feeling froggy, ready to go.
Let's do it.
All right. So to say that you grew up in very interesting times would be an understatement. I've given a bit of backdrop to the listeners, just a tiny drop here in the bucket about your life. But can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. I grew up during the Vietnam and Cold Wars. At school, we would practice duck and cover in the event of a nuclear war. Cuba actually had a nuclear missile pointed at us, so the threat was very real. Unlike today, the Vietnam War was televised live every night on the news. They even showed actual killings and bombings. Every day, even as a child, I could feel the tension in the air. All my brothers and all their friends were worried about the draft and that their number would be called. So there was always this fear that if they called their number, it was a death sentence. All three of my brothers were the right age for the draft. Those days of waiting for the numbers to be called on TV now reminds me of the Hunger Games, you know, when they pulled the name out of the bucket.
Right.
This was also the time of the Civil Rights Movement, the marches led by Martin Luther King, then eventually his assassination. President Kennedy and Jackie were our hope. His assassination was one that everybody remembers where they were when he was killed. Then his brother, Robert, our next hope, to see him shot. It was devastating. But those three instilled the seeds of hope. They taught my generation how to do peaceful marches and sit-ins. And now the beatniks were called hippies, and the numbers grew and grew into a huge movement. Then there was the daily reporting of investigations into Nixon and Watergate and eventually his impeachment. But during these daily visions of wars, civil rights marches, and assassinations, my cousin married this modern artist who was also the only beatnik that lived in our town. He would pick me up at least 3 or 4 times a week in his beat-up VW van and take me to his huge, messy art studio. And for hours I would sit still while he painted my portrait and explained to me the modern art paintings he had created. I was only 4 or 5 years old when all of this started, but he explained it in a way that modern art actually became one of my lifelong loves. A few years later, the good stuff started. Hippies, Woodstock, Haight-Ashbury, sit-ins, the feminist movement, civil rights movement, the end of the war. It was a very exciting time.
Wow, that reads like a novel. I mean, it sounds like a novel. It's amazing. How did growing up in that environment shape the way that you saw the world?
Well, I think my childhood was different from most of my friends. My mother did not shelter me from anything. She explained in detail so I would understand what was going on. I got to watch the news. I got to hang out with a beatnik. I remember when I started kindergarten, I felt different somehow. But unfortunately, I knew I couldn't express my feelings to anyone or we'd get into trouble. I had to keep my knowledge a secret. I realized quickly that all my friends were sheltered. They had not been allowed to watch the news. They were told beatniks and hippies were the scum of the earth, and Martin Luther King was just a troublemaker.
Wow.
In my town, I know, in my town it was considered normal that blacks had separate water fountains, that they were not allowed to eat in the same areas as whites in restaurants, if at all. Even at our movie theater, blacks had to use a separate entrance that took them to the balcony. That's the only place they were allowed to sit.
Wow.
Because of my mother, I know. Because, though, of my mother, I had been shown and explained everything that was happening and that it was wrong. You see, my mother's best friend was black. She had to keep that a secret from the rest of the world, so even though she and Lena went on fun outings all the time, Lena still had to sit in the back seat while Mother drove. Mother also explained to me what was going on with the marches, the civil rights movement, all the gory details of the Vietnam War. But again, I knew that this knowledge had to be kept a secret, or she would be considered a bad mother, unfit parent. If you don't mind, can I tell you one of my mother's stories about how I was taught the awful treatment of women?
Yes, please.
This one day, I saw my mother crying. She told me that one of her best friends had been hanging curtains when a car pulled up. Several men jumped out in white coats, pulled her off the ladder. She ran, but was tackled and strapped into a straitjacket and taken off to the insane asylum in Milledgeville. That was the most horrible, nasty, largest asylum in our country. If you Google it, you'll just faint. Anyway, I asked why. And she told me that if a man got tired of his wife, and this is for any reason, he could be having an affair, he could just be tired, he could pay a doctor in town to sign off on her being crazy. And back then, it only took 2 signatures to commit someone. I was still only around 6 or 7 and didn't completely understand what had happened to her friend. I mean, I was just too young to understand. So one day, she announced we were going to a hospital to visit a friend. We drove the long way to Milledgeville and pulled into this big, long driveway. It had huge grounds. And there were men and women that didn't have on any clothes except those stupid hospital gowns, you know, that are open in the back.
Yeah, yes.
Some were drooling, some were dirty, They had like wild eyes, you know, and messy hair. My eyes were opened. I was in shock. I couldn't even breathe. We parked, and then we walked past more crazy people, more, you know, crazy-looking people, and I literally almost threw up. When we walked inside, the walls were this ugly green color, and the paint was peeling. We had to walk past women rocking baby dolls and men walking in small circles over and over. It was like a horror movie. I remember walking into this small, dirty room where Mother's friend was sitting on a small cot, just staring into space. Of course, by this time, I understood exactly the injustice against women my mother was trying to explain to me, and also the great importance of keeping my mouth shut concerning the knowledge that I gained. Opening your mouth about injustices was the most dangerous thing I could do for my mother. So, well, not only did she show me these injustices, she also showed me the fun side of life that none of my other friends got to see.
Like what? What did she show you?
Well, okay. One day my father announced we were going to do a cross-country trip. It was fantastic. It was the most awesome trip. We went, to all these different states. And we ended up in San Francisco. Now, this was 1969. I was 13 years old, and it was the height of the hippie movement, and San Francisco was its heart. I remember we turned down this street called Haight, and it was on the corner of Ashbury. That's when I learned that Haight-Ashbury was actually two different streets. I didn't know that.
So you were actually at the epicenter of Haight-Ashbury.
I am.
That's crazy.
I know, and I'm 13, which is extremely cool age. So, anyway, Mother started begging, to get out of the car. She and I to get out of the car so we could, go shopping and look at the hippies and stuff like this. But my father, he was, part of the majority. He thought hippies and beatniks or whatever were the scum of the earth and dangerous. So he yelled for us to roll up all our windows, lock the doors, and he went as fast as he could out of there to the hotel. We were in the hotel, and after about an hour, my mother announced to my father that she needed some things from the drugstore and that she was going to take me. So, he told us to be very careful, and he talked through the keys. Well, when we got in the car, she winked at me and announced that we were going to visit one of her girlfriend's sons that was an artist. She drove us straight into the Haight-Ashbury district and parked the car.
Nicely done, Mom.
I know. She was awesome. We walked up some stairs and entered this loft, and there were hippies smoking pot in one room. I didn't even know what pot was at the time. That's where I learned it. And musicians playing folk music at another. But my absolute favorite room was this big room, and all the walls were covered with canvas. There were men and women totally naked, pouring buckets of paint all over their bodies, and then throwing themselves up against the wall to create art.
Yes, yeah. I love it.
I was mesmerized and so excited. I mean, who gets to see that at 13, right? We stayed about an hour roaming from room to room when Mother said it was time to leave. And this is what killed me. When we got in the car, she, in a very serious, strong voice, she said, "You are never to tell anyone what we just did." And, I never did until about a year ago, until they were way past, being deceased, and it didn't matter anymore. I finally started telling people about it. So anyway, that was some of the fun side that she told me.
That's amazing. And what an amazing mother, and a progressive mother for that time, especially because you're growing up